where… about how it influences, I do not know what is the direction of studies which are going on, but I think from what I have heard from people, people are largely trying to measure changes in the brain activity and stuff like that. But it would be helpful because from my experience, I know that the maximum amount of change happens in your belly, in this region, which you call as the gut, because that is where the real change happens and it has consequences in the brain and the rest of the body. So, one important aspect of taking in the moon, there are practices in yoga where you can live like every day, in your experience it's like full moon. The same full moon impact is on in your body on a daily basis, there's a whole lot of practices like that. It is not that the rocks, it is not the influence of the rock upon us, it is not the content or the mineral content of the rock which is making the difference. Maybe that also could be making, but essentially it is the geometric placement of the moon in relation to the planet that it's making the difference. For example, you know there are numbers like this, I am not very good with mathematics, but let me tell you something. The distance between planet Earth and Moon and the distance between planet Earth and Sun is 108 times more, and the diameter is similarly 108 times more. There's a geometric proportion to this. You can look it up, I'm not very good with these numbers. But essentially there is a geometric relationship which is more important.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. So that there's clear description of yoga's influence, or at least the influence of the moon, the relationship between the moon and human physiology is clear in yoga philosophy, right? And so and almost even more intimately connected into our everyday lives than we would ever think, right? Most of our, at least in North American culture, most people hardly recognize that there's a moon outside.
No, that's because they went to the moon, you know, that's a problem.
Yeah, maybe when we start, traveling to the moon as like a, I don't know, as for leisure, it'll be more in its mind, the importance of it. But you also mentioned in your writings that practices from the yogic tradition that specifically are meant for maybe spiritual practices, tying your behaviors on this planet, your spiritual practice. How can a spiritual practice on this planet be influenced by a rock in the sky up there? Is that really a possibility? And if so, how is it interacting with your physiology, at least from the yogic perspective, right? So there's 11-day cycles where there's fasting. It's related to that kind of practice of working with your gut. So I'm really curious about how that may relate to a spiritual experience.
Well, David, we are all this life, including you and me, are living on a rock here which we call as planet Earth, isn't it? It's just a rock for somebody else who is looking at us from elsewhere. So, about how it influences, I do not know what is the direction of studies which are going on, but I think from what I have heard from people, people are largely trying to measure changes in the brain activity and stuff like that. But it would be helpful because from my experience, I know that the maximum amount of change happens in your belly, in this region, which you call as the gut, because that is where the real change happens and it has consequences in the brain and the rest of the body. So, one important aspect of taking in the moon, there are practices in yoga where you can live like every day, in your experience it's like full moon. The same full moon impact is on in your body on a daily basis, there's a whole lot of practices like that. So we say this is somebody has become like an eternal moon within himself, that is like a full moon, always. because certain things can be done in the system. The impact that the full moon has on various aspects of your body, the cellular behavior in the system, this can be replicated on a daily basis simply by activating this dimension. Well, to give some background to that, see, who we are as life is a consequence of how this planet functions. How this planet functions is a consequence of its position in the solar system, and definitely the sun is a major powerhouse which fires everything, and the moon, which is a satellite by our understanding, but it has a significant impact on the production of life on this planet. So what kind of life we are is essentially determined by these two aspects, sun and moon playing their influence upon the planet at various levels. There are other planets which have influences on you, but their impact is much lower and they are significant only to certain people, not for everybody. But fundamentally, sun, moon and the planet are the three celestial objects. These celestial objects, moon, there is so much romance about moon, David just killed it, saying that it's just a rock in the sky. So many people have fallen in love on that day, David. Now you just made a rock in the sky.
Well, why is this rock so special, compared to, other stars in the sky? I mean, it is close, so we see it, we engage with it a little bit more, but is there something unique about the moon itself? Or is it really just an organic sort of artifact of this influence of two massive rocks influencing each other?
It is not that the rocks, it is not the influence of the rock upon us, it is not the content or the mineral content of the rock which is making the difference. Maybe that also could be making, but essentially it is the geometric placement of the moon in relation to the planet that it's making the difference. For example, there are numbers like this. I am not very good with mathematics, but let me tell you something. The distance between planet Earth and moon and the distance between planet Earth and sun is 108 times more, and the diameter is similarly 108 times more. There's a geometric proportion to this. You can look it up, I'm not very good with these numbers. But essentially there is a geometric relationship which is more important. That's why I was telling you, as the circumference increases, its influence will decrease. And about 3,700 years ago, a certain yogi made a calculation that in 28,000 years' time, the influence of moon upon the planet will become so feeble and slowly the moon will start turning its back upon you. That is when human race will go down. Well, now about 3,700 years are gone, so we still have 24,300 years according to that calculation. So, as this 20 millimeter excess of the radius that is happening year on year, which has been confirmed by scientific measurements, if this continues for another 28 years or 28,000 years or so, then they say the influence of moon will become so minimal on the planet that it may not be able to help us to regenerate. So this regeneration process is not in the brain, it is in this region, which is very important. So the influence of the moon maximum is on your gut. So this is the reason in India there is a whole tradition on full moon day how you should eat, on a new moon day how you should eat, for every phase of the moon how you should eat on that day, both in terms of quality of food and the quantity of food, what you should do so that you can get maximum benefit of the moon phase of that time. So one important thing is, in India, this was the practice traditionally in the Hindu calendar, that for all activity that we are doing, there were no weekly holidays, there was 3 days break for full moon and 2 days break for new moon. But there was no Sunday, Monday kind of holidays. So now we've just come to this because these numbers are easy to calculate. You don't have to look up at the sky. As you said, most people who live in cities don't even know there is a moon that exists, they only read about it somewhere. They've never looked up in the sky. At least every month they're not looking it up, definitely not every day. Even the full moon nights, they're missing it completely because the lights are all bright and blazing. So where will they ever, Professor Horace suggested that, the light pollution in Seattle city is much more than the moon, so where will they notice it? They will not notice it unless they're out in the open somewhere. Generally, people notice it if they're in the wild or especially if they're on the ocean, then you cannot ignore the moon, you understand what kind of significance it has. Today, all our marine vessels are powered. Otherwise, in ancient times, tides and mariners are like, inseparable. There is no way. So their full moon, new moon and their expeditions were so very connected. It definitely has more impact than just causing minor differences. We were talking about how the sleep quality changes. I would like to see that scientists like you focus on how our life quality changes with the moon phases, how our wakefulness changes. Why are we talking about sleep? Because I see there is a kind of a fetish about sleep in this country. To sleep well, to sleep well. No, to live well is more important than to sleep well. If you live well, you will sleep well.
That's a really good point. Horacio, could you
Yes.
maybe comment on some of what Sadhguru has been alluding to, at least from not only from the yogic scriptures of a more intimate relationship that humans have with the moon on a daily basis, the different behaviors of fasting, of how they, bring in food depending on the phases. Do you see the phases of the moon influencing any other aspect of human physiology in your research?
So, well, other than nocturnal activity and sleep, there have been several reports, particularly in relation to mental health, right? And this is really interesting because of what Sadhguru was saying, that any character that you have will be enhanced at given phases of the moon cycle, right? And of course, if you think, for instance, about a psychotic patient, right? If you think about our sleep-wake cycles, right, that are modulated by the moon cycle, then if you're going to stay up later on the nights that are leading to the full moon, then you'd have more of an opportunity to exhibit your psychotic symptoms, right? And this could be perceived by other people as an enhancement of the psychotic symptoms. But it turns out that there's some literature that really suggests that there may be a real enhancement of those symptoms. And this is particularly in bipolar patients that, I don't know to what extent the audience knows about this, but bipolar patients are characterized by this cycling between depressive and manic states, right? And it turns out that it's very well characterized that in a bipolar patient, if you shorten the sleep, whether spontaneously or you force this for environmental influences, they will get more manic, whereas if you lengthen sleep, that's associated with more depressive symptoms. And it turns out that there's been several publications showing that bipolar patients had a very striking synchronization, some bipolar patients, right, with the moon phases, and in turn, that seems to be related with symptoms of the disease. And this would make sense, right? If you're going to shorten your sleep around the nights before the new moon, before the full moon, that could lead to more manic expression of the disease. Whereas if you're going to lengthen it before the new moon, that could lead to more depressive symptoms of the disease. What I find really fascinating, this idea that any personal character that you have, will be enhanced by the moon cycle. And I guess, one one question that I was thinking about is there something special about the nights leading to the full moon in terms of preparation for that night of the full moon in the yoga culture, right? Because that's when we find that main effect, right? That sleep is more severely affected on the nights previous to the full moon, not on the night of the full moon itself. So I wonder whether there are some practices that are associated with those nights specifically, right? Or with those days in general. So anyway, I don't know if I answer your question, David, but
well, yeah, no, this is it. You're alluding to this. The question really is still unknown. How and Sadhguru,
yeah.
you also posed the question: how does the moon really influence behavior? We don't really understand that at least the gravitational mechanism. The light sensitivity one's interesting in the sense that, so you said that the light that's produced by the moon is not even as bright as the pollution you get from the city.
Yeah.
So why would you be more sensitive to that light, even through another mechanism like a gravitational force?
Yeah. Yeah, and of course we don't know what the mechanism is, but it's a fascinating question, and it goes back to what Sadhguru is saying, that yes, we live in an environment where we're completely unaware of what the moon is doing in terms of the lunar month, right? But yet, there may be inescapable influences of the moon on our physiology, right? That even if you live in a completely isolated built environment with thick curtains, turning the artificial light whenever you want, you may still be under that influence. And that's suggested by our research in these highly urbanized environments like Seattle.
It's fascinating. So I was involved in some research actually at Brigham Women's Hospital that looked at circadian rhythms, and Charles Czeisler, who is one of the world-renowned experts in this area, he showed that you can use a light cue as small as a spot of light, maybe the size of a nickel, on the back of your knee, to actually influence your circadian rhythm, to change the rhythm. So if light that small,
actually, yeah, I think that the story on the light on the back of the knee was finally not. It wasn't from Chuck Czeisler's lab, but I think that didn't eventually hold. That story was from another lab, but in any case, but I guess the point, which is very important, is that very dim light can influence your circadian system, right? And much dimmer than we used to think about.
And a question would be, do you think that the spectrum of light from the moon is something unique compared to, say, other artificial light?
So, it likely is, but we don't think that that's probably how, that was probably the most important, if you want, throughout evolution, the most important selective pressure for nocturnal activity. Again, going back to our ancestors, right? If you think about somebody living in Europe 30,000 years ago, where, throughout the fall, the days are getting shorter and shorter, and you need to gather food for the whole winter. Well, any extra little bit of light that you could get in the evening, you take advantage of it, right? If you think from that perspective, that must have been a tremendous influence. And we have the latest records indicates that we have 300,000 years of human evolution on Earth, right? That effect of the moon has been there for 300,000 years, and it's, to me, it's almost intuitive that there may have been selective pressures from the moon throughout evolution to actually influence our physiology, right?
Is there anything from the sciences to suggest that, because that's what Sadhguru was alluding to also, was that the moon is shifting on its axis, and so is our magnetic poles, and we know that is also influencing rhythms biologically and on Earth seasonally. So I'm wondering, it from your perspective, do you see any changes maybe over the last 30 years or so since you started doing this work, and how the moon's change in its spatial orientation is maybe influencing?
No, not that I know, and I think 30 years would probably be very short. You know, if we think about the timeline that Sadhguru was talking about, we're talking about almost 30,000 years, right? So half a lifetime probably will not capture that, right? But you know, at least as far as I know, I don't know of any studies that have looked at that specifically.
But do you see a cautious kind of interpretation of what's happening with you know, in astronomy, like how the moon is actually shifting is going to affect maybe some of the work that you're doing in circadian?
Well, I guess, you know, eventually, if the moon cycle changes in its period, right, we should expect that our response to it will also change accordingly, right? You know, even if it is small changes, that would be a prediction that could be tested. But again, I don't know how big those differences will be, you know, in our testable life, right? I mean, at least in my life, I don't think I'll see those changes.
That understood. That's probably well said. I would ask, though, given our limited amount of time together, that Sadhguru had alluded also to the relationship of mysticism or spirituality and the moon with humans. And I know you've done some work with animals and melatonin. I'm wondering if you could, you know, in the best way possible, to summarize that work. And I only bring it up because melatonin is this precursor to was it dimethyltryptamine, which is a psychedelic. It's produced in the pineal gland, and it has all these implications for mysticism. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the work you've seen in that.
Yeah, so, you know, we've done some studies in animals, and one study specifically where we studied the moon cycle in animals is with monkeys that are actually nocturnal, which are very rare. They live throughout South America. This is the only genus of monkeys that are truly nocturnal. And amazingly, you know, these animals are heavily dependent on the lunar cycle, right? So it's kind of going back to what Sadhguru was saying, that, you know, people that are connected with nature are very well aware, right, of what the moon does to them and how they depend on the moon, even for agriculture. You know, I mean, people are timing when they plant and when they collect based on lunar cycles. Well, for animals, it's even more. And I don't think there's probably any single species that lives in the wild that is not somehow connected in its sleep and circadian rhythmicity with the lunar cycle, right? It would be very unlikely that that's the case. I'm talking about animals, right? I guess going to melatonin, of course, is this amazing signal for the brain of where your biological night is. And one of the things that we're trying to determine now is where the lunar phase has the ability of changing that biological night signal, which is melatonin. Melatonin is the most important signal for the brain in terms of when is it that it's a biological night, right? And we think that maybe one of the mechanisms by which the moon may change the timing of your sleep is by changing that nocturnal signal, right, that marks the beginning of the night. But there's still no evidence, neither from animal models nor from human models. We're kind of moving towards that in the next phases of these studies.
But melatonin in general is you know, it's produced by the pineal gland. Could you comment on? It's controversial in the sense that it's been thought of as like a mystical chemical.
Yeah, you know, I don't know how strong that evidence is. You know, it's clearly, you know, an extremely important signal for the brain to know where your internal night is. And of course, you know, part of the problem is that artificial light can acutely inhibit the release of melatonin. So we are every single day we're tampering with that natural nocturnal signal by getting exposed to even very dim levels of light. You know, the light that you use to read a book next to your bed is sufficient to inhibit melatonin. So we're always sending the brain the signal that the night has not started, when in fact it has, right?
Yeah, that's very helpful, just to give a sense of how, you know, the body has this internal endogenous clock, right? That helps keep our time within the same periodicity of a day, right? Day is
Yes.
24 hours, but our natural rhythm is around 25 hours, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And then there's this chemical in the brain that's released from, you know, what Descartes referred to as the seat of the soul, and
Yes.
the Egyptians, you know, referred to as the eye of Horus. The only unilateral structure in the brain is
In the brain.
And it seems like a very interesting structure, and it's been implicated in well, mystical states only because there is some limited data, like Horacio is alluding to, that its data is not very convincing, but it is the data that does exist. It shows that it's a precursor to a chemical that's naturally occurring in the brain and is DMT. It's a psychedelic that's used for very short, intense psychedelic experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I was thinking with Sadhguru, you've been referring to the moon and working with the moon, the cycle of the moon specifically for spiritual purposes. You have shown, Horacio, that birds have daily variations in melatonin that disappear on full moon days. Is that right? Is that?
No, that's not my work.
Okay, but
I was actually not aware of that.
well, there is some data that's showing that the fluctuations in melatonin vary on the lunar cycle. Is that something that you have observed in your work?
Not yet. No, and we are actually gearing to do those experiments, those studies in human subjects, but we need to do that under laboratory conditions because of the fact that humans are very bad at exposing themselves to artificial light and erasing the natural signal of the night, which is melatonin. So in order to capture that, you need to put them in a lab where they remain very relaxed under very dim light, and then you can really see where is the natural melatonin signal sitting at in terms of noise.
Wow.
Well, David, the thing is, see, in the yogic system, there are simple processes with which, particularly on full moon nights, where you can get totally stoned out just on moonlight.
Mm-hmm.
There are processes to do that. And as you can see, I don't know what that DMT is, you can see I'm on it all the time. No substance from outside, it's from within. It is in some way, on one level, in the physiological level, the significance of yoga is to stay in tune with the sun and moon cycles in relation to the planet. That is the only way this life can be in balance and with least amount of friction within itself, because then the life's experience as… I mean, whatever the chemicals you're discussing, serotonin, melatonin, all this stuff, essentially you're saying chemistry determines the nature of your experience of life itself. So, to maintain that chemistry which is always blissful and ecstatic, moon and being aligned with the moon is a very important part of it. So, there are various practices associated with that. One thing I would like to request Professor Horace is if they can invest a certain amount of attention towards what is happening in the gut with the full moon, new moon. I think it may be far more easily measurable than what is happening in the brain, because what is happening in the brain, we see it only as a consequence. The real thing is happening in the gut. You may see certain effects in the brain. What is a consequence is one thing, but the process, the changes that are happening within the gut region is very big, and it is probably more easily measurable in my limited understanding of science, I'm saying, because what is happening is there more solid kind of stuff, it is more tangible, that maybe it is more easily measurable than what's happening in the brain.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and there's a lot of research emerging on the importance of the gut, not just in general physiology and neuroscience, but particularly in circadian rhythms. So, and there are definitely some physiological outputs that we could look at in our studies. So that's a great suggestion.
Well, I think there are implications for this work, and this kind of dialogue and collaboration is really great. We are limited in our time together today. So in closing, are there any reflections that you want to reflect upon at this time? Horacio, maybe we could start with you, and then we can end with Sadhguru.
Well, I guess, the main reflection is that we tend to think that we humans are very good at isolating ourselves from nature. And I think our research clearly shows that there are some aspects of nature that are unavoidable, right? Like, for instance, maybe we're all under the influence of the moon, even when we're not paying any attention to it. So that'll be my message too.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that clearly there's things happening in our environment that we're not aware of, right? That doesn't register in our sensory stores, but that have very strong influence on us. And they only manifest, or we only see it when, for example, in a female reproductive system has a very clear rhythm to it. And when there's one rhythm in one biological system and another rhythm in a very strong physical system, they're going to influence each other. So that makes total intuitive sense. Sadhguru, please, I'd love to hear. I think all of the audience would love to hear your reflections on how you think scientists continue to work with yogis and yogi philosophy to better understand the influence of moon on behavior and mood.
See, I mean, I'm not… with all due respect, I'm saying this. See, there are many instruments which are being used to analyze this data that you gather. But, well, it's… at least in my perception, it is well established the most sophisticated instrument on this planet is the human mechanism itself. So, what is happening in the human mechanism? To measure that, do we have instruments which are sophisticated enough to what's happening there? So, why can't we do experiments where people who are in different… at least at a certain level of sadhana, their body itself is treated as an instrument of measurement, what is happening there, not necessarily taking their blood samples or neurological impulses and saying this and that. Yes, that is important at one level, but I'm saying beyond that, why don't we prepare people who the very body can be treated as an instrument, what it is saying, that is more important, because ultimately that is human experience also. So if we want the efforts of scientists to become a practical, implementable process, I think if we… I know this may be deflecting or deviating from how science has been till now, but I feel a time has come for that, because in this modern sciences, they clearly recognize there cannot be another gadget on this planet which is more sensitive, more sophisticated than human body itself. So how to use that, if scientists can arrive at that, I think what is going at a snail's pace could go leaps and bounds, and this generation could benefit, not some other future generation.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So now, and I apologize for having to leave early, but I really need to go to that
Thank you, Doctor, for
ceremony.
this.
Thank you very much, everybody, and it's been a great experience to hear you, Sadhguru, and all your wisdom and ideas. I already have at least a couple of ideas that are that may actually change how we go over our studies. So thanks a lot.
Namaskaram. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, both of you, for participating today, and thank you all for listening and participating wherever you may be. May the moon have good influences on you all.
And thanks a lot, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. And don't call it a rock, huh?
Don't call it a rock. Okay.
Namaskar.
Namaskar.